Hello, welcome to my lecture of paper conservation science in the course of Information and Media of Museum. My name is Kang Lee. I am a conservation scientist, especially focusing on paper cultural heritage. I am interested in researches about the paper aging using old book papers and Asian papers, even including painting materials to clarify the method to protect paper objects for a long period of time. Conservation science is a field of composite science which requires the knowledge of history, archaeology, natural science, philosophy, and so on. So the purpose of conservation science is not only for protecting objects, but also for elucidating the degradation mechanism, manufacturing techniques, developing new restoration methods, and improving storage environment with scientific help. In this class, we will mainly focus on the paper conservation science. Paper is a very familiar object to us, and there is no difficulty in adding scientific content to a lecture. First of all, what we have to recognize as a fact is that there are vast amounts of paper cultural heritage left that we have to protect, and there are many things that deteriorate significantly. Of course, some paper objects are excavated from the buried environment, but in many cases, many of them remain or are handed down as traditional products. If you imagine objects made of paper, you can think of painting, hanging scroll, folding screen, documents, and even book objects. In the first place, such kind of paper objects are offered as a medium for preserving and utilizing recorded information, but the object constituting paper deteriorates physico-chemically over time. Eventually, the paper becomes brittle and damaged, resulting in shorter lifespan. For this reason, it is necessary to extend the lifespan of the paper, and we need to utilize the natural scientific techniques in order to use the information in the paper for a longer time. For this, we should identify the cause of the degradation. If we can know whether the cause of degradation derived from the inside of the paper or from external environmental factors which surrounded the paper objects, we can predict and also inhibit the degradation phenomenon. Besides, if necessary, the lifespan of paper can be extended by performing some preservation treatment on paper with remarkable degradation in scientific way or even in traditional way. Furthermore, the raw materials and manufacturing method of paper for maintaining a longer lifespan can be devised with future preservation in mind from the stage of making paper. Therefore, in this class, we will consider factors that contribute to the longer preservation of paper. First of all, we will look at the historical flow of paper, and we will look at the scientific characteristics of paper that contribute to the preservation of paper in relation to the manufacturing method of paper. Next, we will look at the degradation phenomenon of paper, and we also look at the acidification treatment and preservation environment management in relation to the preservation measures against degradation. So let's take a look at some important scenes in the historical trend of the development of paper making techniques in relation to the characteristic of paper. First of all, what was used in the past as a differentiated writing material from the paper defined in modern times. And as you know, 5,000 years ago in Egypt, a writing material called papyrus was used. This is a plant called Cyprus papyrus that uses a sharp stone or a metal knife to thinly cut into plates and lay them on top of each other in the orthogonal direction, and then beat them with a hammer to compress them. Papyrus is also an excellent writing material, but it is another low material obtained by defiberizing the plant fibers, so the origin of paper cannot be considered papyrus. Although the origin of the term paper in English originated from papyrus, the low materials and manufacturing techniques are totally different from the paper. Parchment is originated from Pergamon, the old city, which has been used for almost 2,500 years as other lighting materials, mainly made by tearing the skin of a sheep. The side of the latter where the fur growth is strong, and the opposite side with the meat inside becomes parchment. This parchment is treated with lime for a long time and scratched with a knife with a round blade, and then polished smoothly using a hard stone as shown in this drawing. In Europe, it is said that the parchment has been used for a precious book even after woodblock printing and letterpress printing appeared in the 14th and 15th centuries. And about 300 sheep were sacrificed to make a book of the Gutenberg Bible. Parchment is still in great demand today as a durable material for printing documents. In India, plant ribs of the palm family called patra was used as writing material, and there is a thing called tapa, which is the Polynesian language, which means paper made of bark of plants, which is used all the way to islands in the South Pacific to Peru in South America, over a large area of the Pacific Rim. This is a fabric-shaped sheet made by tapping the soaked inner bark of the moraceous plant with a thin rod and stretching it out into a thin plate. Meanwhile, in China, traces of lighting on the scapula of livestock such as turtle shell and cattle or sheep remains in the Yin dynasty of the 17th to 11th century BC. It is well known as the inscriptions on bones and tortoise carapaces. And there were also cases where letters were left on the stone plates, bronze plates, or jade stone. Thus we know that various objects such as clay, animal bones, and some bark of a tree had been used as writing materials before paper appeared. However, these objects were difficult to obtain in large quantities, and they were difficult to supply and use because they were heavy. It was also less portable because the object was hard and it could not be rolled or ported. To solve this problem, Chinese invented narrow wooden strips like this shape around the 13th century BC, which used the bamboo planks by tying them together with thread. But because these wooden strips was hard and stiff, it was inconvenient to write using stylus, and the bundle of wooden strips required considerable space, and the handling was also difficult to keep them. These wooden strips are utilized for a few centuries, and then writing brush was invented around the 3rd century BC. Therefore, Chinese ink or lacquer can be used to write text. After that, as the sericulture industry, which means silk manufacture, is developed, many aristocrats in China used silk fabrics or their rags as writing material, and since the brush already exists, there was no need to use heavy wooden strips anymore. Though the use of heavy wooden strip was refrained, thick fabric was light, soft, and large to use, so it was a better object for writing as well as painting. However, the problem was that it was not spread to the public because it was expensive. After that, later Han Dynasty unified all the countries and stabilized the nation. Since then, society, economy, science, and culture were greatly developed. As a result, people's demand for writing materials in their daily lives was increased. However, as we can find in the Book of the Later Han, because silk fabric at the time was reputed to be expensive and wooden street was heavy, so naturally, cheap and easily available writing material was required. So, rags made of plant fibers appeared as a writing material other than silk, and that texture was also suitable for the purpose of writing letters using a writing brush. People at the time made fabrics out of plant fibers and cut and discarded the wasted fabric. So they must not have used the wasted fabric itself as a writing material. This is an example of a felt made from modern fabrics, which is simply compress the fabrics to make shape of a sheet. People at the time already knew the felt making techniques before weaving technique, so it can be assumed that discarded fabric was beaten into fibers, and the fibers were entangled and intertwined to form a thin sheet for use in writing. Regarding this, a literature published in China about AD 100, which is the oldest Chinese dictionary of Chinese characters, mentioned about how the paper was first officially made. That dictionary implies paper is made of silk fibers by washing and tearing silkworm cocoons and spreading on the bamboo screen. This figure shows the process of making silk thread in ancient time in other historical literature, which was made by beating the silk cocoons in the water contained in a wooden basket with sticks to make silk suspension, and form fiber layers by collecting on the basket and then drying it. The dictionary called this silk fiber sheet as paper. But let's think about it here. The physical strength of a silk fiber sheet, specifically the bonding strength of silk fiber, is almost zero, even if the mass of a silk thread is immersed in water, beaten to form layers on the screen, and dry them. I want you to check it out when you get home today. There must be a washing net attached to the washing machine, but if you look inside it, you can see that dried lint is accumulated in sheets. We can think of it as similar. Even if the adhesive is not added to the fibers, it remains low silk fibers even after drying. Therefore, this explanation is scientifically impossible. In other words, the lint from this cocoon can only be used to make thread. It is similar to a paper, but it is not a paper, and it cannot be a paper. This is because the composition is totally different from the paper, and above all, it does not have a strength as a paper sheet. For reference, paper has a structure in which hydrogen bonds occur when moisture is added between cellulose chains, which is the main component of paper, and when look at it as a larger scale, the fibers are tangled and pressed like a shape of felt. But low silk has sericin and fibrin unlike plant fibers because they are all polymeric compounds of animal proteins. Hydrogen bonds do not occur between protein molecules, so they cannot be a paper, and there is no such an example. What I want to say here is that the possibility of making paper from silk thread is denied. However, the making process of silk fabric has influenced the theory of paper making. In other words, when a discarded fabric composed of plant fiber is soaked in water and beaten, the plant fibers decompose and defiberize, and the debris of the plant fiber is collected on the screen to form fiber layers. And then when water flows out of the gap on the screen, the layer of tangled fiber remains. And finally, when these fiber assemblies are dehydrated and dried, they become strong paper with a compressed layer of fiber. This is thought to be the basic principle of when paper was first made, as you can see in the example of old paper making in Tibet. Based on this, let's guess how the silk making process can provide the technical theory of subsequent paper making at the time. For example, calligraphy work at the time was written on a loose hemp fabric, and it was completed with a scroll cut to a proper length, so there would be a small piece of fabric left to be used. Perhaps this cut off and discarded fabric must be reused. It is commonly known for the time of invention of paper back to AD 105 by Kai Run, but there would probably be a long gap between the first attempt to make paper by breaking down fibers using felt making process, as I just said before, and the official announcement by the Kai Run. So the time of AD 105 is likely to be assigned arbitrarily. The Book of Kai Run also states that paper was made of such as bark of a tree, wasted hemp fabric, and fishing net. Although the bark is collected soft-bast from the inside of the plant and using it as a paper raw material, but wasted hemp fabric and fishing net are made from hemp rags, and it is highly likely that it has already been used before that time. Thus, the origin of the paper now is returned more than 2,100 years ago based on archaeological excavations. When an ancient city was excavated at Pangmatan in Gansu province right here in 1986, there was a tomb presumed to be formed in the 2nd century BC of the early former Han dynasty. What is most interesting here is that a paper map was placed on the chest of the burial site where the drawing line was found. This paper is called the Pangmatan paper, which is the oldest paper in the world nowadays. And because it is already used as a map, paper object is thought to be used before that time. Most of the fibers of this paper made up of hemp fibers, and some of the rami fibers was mixed in it. Another paper artifact of a similar period of Pangmatan paper, called Bakiao paper, was excavated also around the Gansu and Shaanxi province over here, which was announced as the oldest paper until the Pangmatan paper was excavated. This is presumed to be a wrapping paper that wraps up the bronze mirror, which is presumed to be made before 118 BC from the time of use of the coins excavated with this. Until the microscopic analysis, it was reported as silk fabric, but it turned out plant fibers paper that made of hemp and rami fibers as same as Pangmatan paper. However, because this paper was not excavated by archaeologists, it remains for debate. And as for Jingguan paper, it was discovered by archaeologists. It was found to be hemp paper by analysis. Also, there were several similar types of paper were excavated, especially around this area. As a result of this archaeological excavation, it is believed that there were already papers around the 2nd century BC, and these fibers are thought to be originated from discarded hemp fabrics. The type of fiber is originated from bast fiber rather than wood fiber. Bast fiber means fibers collected from plant stems, but it is believed that fibers for paper at the time were not collected directly from plants, but discarded fabrics were returned to the fibers. Therefore, it is estimated that primitive paper was made of rag that was used up as a fabric because of its rough texture and low whiteness, thickness, and low density. This is an experiment making primitive form of paper like felt type sheet using hemp rag by referring to the paper method of the former Han dynasty. The rags are immersed in water for a long time and keep beating the wet fabrics to be individually separated into fibers. Then the pulp suspension is poured into a mesh-shaped fabric screen and filtered and dehydrated. Then sheet was dried to obtain a crude but flat sheet with a constant strength. Because the paper sheet was thick and crude, you can think of it as just a crude assembly of fibers rather than a paper for writing. Therefore, primitive paper could not have been compared to silk as a writing material, and I think it was a little later that it began to be used for writing in earnest. In other words, rather than the hemp paper appeared as a purpose for writing material in the beginning, it would have gradually changed and improved its use and started to be used as a writing material. In any case, the way to use the discarded fabric as a paper was often, and the improvement continued after that. From that time, the paper made of plant fibers satisfied the social needs by making thin fiber tissues cheaper than silk and more practical than wooden strips, and it is generally said that the person who gathered the techniques is Chiron. Now let's talk about the Japanese paper. Japanese paper was propagated from Korean peninsula early 7th century, and in the Nara period in 8th century, paper was mainly used for official documents such as sutra transcription, family register, and account book. The only fiber source of the Japanese papers used on that time were mostly made of hemp fiber, which Chinese way of thinking about the paper making was conveyed. So there were some traces of cultivating hemp in Japan. However, kojo, which is the bark of mulberry tree, was offered as a substitute material for hemp, and it became the main fiber source for Japanese paper. For example, as you can see here, these family register papers were made in Japan, and one of the oldest documents was made in Ono province, where we call the Mino province nowadays, composed of kojo fiber as the main component. And for the paper of Fujian province, where was located around Fukuoka nowadays, kojo and gampi fibers are mixed together. Kojo and gampi are actually distributed in East Asian and Southeast Asian countries. In other words, kojo and gampi fibers were newly introduced as paper material in Japan. The first paper making process in Japan was written in Engishiki in 927, which was the law at the time. In the Heian period, a paper making studio called Kamiyain was established in Bureau called Jushoryo, and the paper making method recorded in Engishiki was spread to local areas through Kamiyain. The paper making process in Engishiki was a common technique in areas where paper was widely used in Japan, though it was a provision concerning how to make ancient paper. In other words, it is simply written that paper is made by cooking, selecting, cutting, beating, and making, but as numbers are written in here, it was very convenient to be able to see the daily workload and how much work can be handled in the season depending on the ranks of the sunlight for each plant and each process. In other words, since the sunlight time was longer in summer, it was possible to treat more raw materials than in winter. In the paper making process in Engishiki, hemp rags, kojo fiber, hemp fiber, gampi fiber, and sopra plant fibers were utilized for raw material. As for the representative paper in Japan, the bark of kojo is cut down in the season from November to December and steaming it to remove the bark easily. Looking at the filled bark of kojo, there is a black bark called kurokawa, which is attached to the outside, and green bark called amakawa in the middle, and the white layer called shirokawa in the innermost part. In general, only the shirokawa acquired by skinning is used to make a spirale paper. The skinned white layer of kojo is not a pure fiber yet in this stage and contains various impurities as a components. In addition to lignin and pectin, it also contains impurities such as starch, protein, and fat. If paper is made with such impurities on it, the quality of the paper deteriorates because it easily changes the color of paper over time. Therefore, in order to make excellent paper, it is desirable to remove such impurities and make them only with pure fibers as much as possible. To acquire pure fibers, fiberization is necessary. Whether the fiber source is originated from wood or other plants, and whether it is mechanical or chemical way of making, it is necessary to retain cellulose, the main component of the fiber. For this reason, traditionally, the shirokawa is boiled with alkaline solution which was obtained from wood ash made of reed and light straw and so on, like this way, which contains calcium carbonate as the main component. In boiling process, which is also called cooking, non-fiber substances that are stuck to the low plant material, which is insoluble, can be dissolved and removed. So, cellulose, the main component of paper, can be retained and the fiber becomes soft. By the way, there is a problem with the unit price of Japanese paper manufacturing nowadays. So, many imported kojo from Thailand or other Southeast Asian countries are used instead of domestic kojo, which causes problems in preservation. Southeast Asian kojo has a lot of legend and needs to be boiled and removed, but it doesn't work with wood ash, so producers use strong alkaline chemicals such as sodium carbonate or sodium hydroxide to shorten the boiling time. It is important to note that bast fibers from plants are originally stable substances, slightly weak in acid, but resistant to alkalis. The strong alkaline solutions do not damage the fibers very much, and only impurities are soluble in water. However, if the boiling time is prolonged by using strong alkaline chemicals to obtain pure fibers, the amount of fibers obtained will be reduced, and the fibers will be damaged and lose their luster and reduce their strength. To what extent it should be cooked is the skill that requires long experience. Among them, caustic soda, the sodium hydroxide has a strong alkalinity which can later affect the preservation of paper. The fibers are boiled, but there are still foreign substances such as debris of bark and uncooked fibers, and the boiling liquid is still attached to the fibers. And the boiled fiber bundles are not separated each fiber yet, like this shape, which is too long to make paper as it is. In this state, if a paper sheet is made, the paper will be lumped, there are many pores, and the surface becomes crude, thus decreasing the paper strength. So, wash the cooked fibers with water to remove them. In ancient times, chemical bleaching was not performed yet, so careful washing was carried out to remove foreign substances from the raw material. Compared to the modern Japanese paper that use bleaching agent, it is also the main reason why the Japanese paper at the ancient time was hardly oxidized and remains in its original color. In raw material, plant fibers gather to form a bundle of fibers which do not collapse even after cooking and washing process. Therefore, in order to make even, smooth, and dense paper, it is necessary to break down by beating the fiber bundles. The fibers should be disassembled until they become individual single fibers rather than lumped fibers, which is suitable for paper making. This process is called beating. This work can be done by hand to some extent, but if you make the paper in that way, the surface of paper becomes quite uneven and the formation and strength decrease. With regard to this, in Engishiki, the process is divided into two processes: a short cutting process and a pounding process using a wood hammer to swell and soften the cut fibers. In modern times, there are automatic beaters such as pounding machine and Naginata beater, which rotate four sword-shaped teeth in water to disperse and defiberize the fibers in water. The fact that fibers stick is important. For example, if you imagine of fabrics, they are not as hard as paper. The reason is that the fixation does not occur at the point where the threads intersect. And for example, in fabric, which is dried by applying glue to it, the fixation occurs at the intersection of the threads, so it feels similar to hard paper. Of course, paper does not use glue to fix fibers. The fibers themselves do not adhere strongly to each other, but by directly applying physical force to the fibers by performing beating, they stick to each other, resulting in having strength as paper, which is an important process of determining the properties of paper. It is easy to understand with this figure by conducting beating. The wet fibers are separated into individual fibers, and the outer layers of the fibers are partially filled and interlayer inside the fibers are compressed to make them flexible. So that fibers fit well with each other, and as plasticity increases, the bonding area between fibers increases and is easily compressed to create a dense structure, and durable paper can be obtained. But if beating is not enough, the contact surface between fibers is small and gaps between the fiber layers are not sufficiently combined, so we can say that beating process is an important factor in determining the physical properties of paper. Looking at the effect of degree of beating on the physical properties of paper, in this graph, the horizontal axis represents the beating time and the vertical axis represents the paper strength. As we know, the longer the beating time, the more the fibers adhere to each other. So, for example, when such a tensor force is applied, the resistance increases like this. And in the case of loose paper, due to the low beating, the strength is not concentrated in one place on paper. So when paper is torn like this, the resistance to the tear is high at the beginning, but when the beating time is prolonged so that the fibers are combined to each other, the force is concentrated in one place, so it is easily torn. And beating inevitably damages the fiber, so the strength tends to decrease over longer beating time. So we have to come from the appropriate time of beating, considering the maintaining the paper strength. Finally, regarding the paper making process, fibers that have been beaten are dispersed in water in a bath to form thin fiber layers. In Japan, screens made of grass or bamboo are used, and in Europe, metal wire is used instead. The principle is the same. When pulp suspension dispersed with fibers is pumped up with a screen and water drains through a gap between screen, a thin fiber layer remains on the surface of the screen, which is compressed and dehydrated the wet paper and then dry them under sunlight. In the process of paper making, we will see a little more about how to make a paper. as hemp fibers used in China was adopted in Japan in early age. So the method of making paper was also Chinese way, which is called tamezuki in Japanese. I will show you a short video. In this conventional method, which is shaking the pulp suspension on the square frame screen in a clockwise manner to drain water easily, because it is necessary to spray the pulp suspension scooped up on the screen evenly as much as possible. However, there were major drawbacks in the Tamezuki method, which is derived from plant fibers. Plant fibers have two properties: sedimentation and cohesiveness in water. And paper making techniques can obtain excellent paper by controlling these two properties. In other words, it is necessary to disperse the fibers well in water, but if the fibers are not carefully cut, they will not be dispersed well in water, so that paper with poor texture can be produced. Therefore, in order to improve the formation of the paper, the length of the fiber should be shortened by beating and cutting the fiber in Tamezuki method, which takes time and efforts. As a result, the fibers are made to be filled with water and swollen to make the fibers themselves viscous, thereby suppressing the properties of sinking and gathering. Compared to this conventional Tamezuki method, Nagashizuki is the Japanese unique paper making method established since the early 10th century. In ancient times, hemp was mainly used as a raw material for paper, but even after it changed to kojo fiber later, cutting the fibers took a lot of time and effort according to the conventional Tamezuki method. It took a lot of time to cut the fibers carefully in order to get a paper of good texture using kojo fibers. So the paper makers at the time thought about how to get a good formation of paper without cutting it carefully. It was accidentally found that paper with a good formation can be obtained by using sticky agent contained in certain plants, such as Ibica, without having to cut fibers carefully. This led to new paper making method called Nagashizuki. At this time, when sticky agent extract from root of Ibica was applied to the pulp suspension, the viscosity of the pulp suspension increases, helping the dispersion of fibers in water. So it was no longer necessary to cut the fibers carefully as before. I will show you another video.
代にわたり人間国宝となられた9代岩野一兵衛さんに越前法書について伺いました。岩野さんは平成12年6月人間国宝に認定されました。
私の父はね、この気づき法蔵っていう紙を私はひょっと
Let me show one more time. Because water is slowly removed from the screen due to the sticky agent, the screen should be shook several times back and forth to drain the water quickly under the screen. In this way, Nagashizuki method was established as a technique for making thin but strong Japanese paper. As a result, it was found that even if the paper is made without carefully cutting the fibers, a dense paper with evenness can be obtained, so it shifted from Tamezuki method to Nagashizuki method, and it established in the early Heian period. As dispersibility of fibers in water can be controlled by adding viscose sticky agent in this way, thin but strong paper can be made, and thus Nagashizuki method has been established so far. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for listening.